Hello, and welcome to Conversations with Reverend G. I am Reverend Grenetta Mason, aka Reverend G, and I'm here every Monday night bringing you conversations with guests from all walks of life with different perspectives. We share about life, we share about love, and we share about spirituality. And we talk about spirituality from a practical point of view. How can it support you in your everyday life? We talk about the spiritual practices, and I always talk about the spiritual toolkit and what spiritual practices are in your spiritual toolkit. We share our practices in hopes that some of our practices you'll be able to try out and use when you need some support, some clarity. We have so much going on in our lives that we need something to sometimes have us stop, pause, take a moment. There's also times when we're like really confused and we don't know what's going on. Where do we go? Where do we go to find the comfort and the joy and the peace? I'm about supporting you in living your best life with joy, with grace and ease. So I hope that in sharing spiritual practices and the different guests that I have on, we can support you in taking on your life and taking it to the next level. You can find me every day on Facebook as Reverend Grenetta Mason. I'm on Instagram as Rev Grenetta. And I have spiritual, inspirational messages each day that I hope can, just get you started in the day. Or if you need something in the middle of the day, support you in moving to your next level. So today I am very excited about my guest, Elizabeth Solomon. Elizabeth is a coach, she's a consultant, and she's a creative. And it's a
Mm.
great combination. Hey, Liz, how are
Mm.
you?
Nada. Mm. Mm. Happy to be here with you.
Yes,
Mm.
I'm excited to have you here too.
Mm.
I remember I took a writing class with you,
Mhm.
and I still it was so good because I don't think I've taken a writing class before, and the depth of it was how we got to write, and then we got to learn, and we had to experiment with different things. I found myself writing from a different perspective because I've just not been a writer. And I tell you what I remember now, when I go to like even the beach or nature, I think
Mm.
of you because now I can express it in a different way just from that class that we
Mm.
had. So I thought that's how I remember you, right? And like my perspective opened up to where I can use the right words to really express what I was seeing, feeling. You know how you took us through the senses and being able to write. So I really appreciated that. Aside from all that, all the other things that you do, right, to make a difference and support people. I think I want to start. I know you're a coach, and I know that you work with EI, emotional intelligence. So, talk about what that is, how you work in that field to support people.
Yeah. Um, I just want to say, I just love that module that we did on having you tune into the senses has had such a ripple impact. And it just reminds me, it's like, we have these interactions or we do these things with people or we collaborate and then we have no idea like how that stays with them. So it's really sweet to hear that. So yeah, I am a certified emotional intelligence coach, and in really simple terms, what that means is that I really help people tune in to what they're feeling, help them cultivate self-awareness, help them think about how those feelings show up in their interactions, show up in the workplace. Um, and so, emotional intelligence at its core really is about being intelligent about our emotions, cultivating the self awareness, and then also cultivating the awareness of the emotions of other people around us. and how those emotions impact our connections in the workplace, how they impact our performance and our relationship to the environments that we live and work in. So that's at a very high level. Uh,
Yeah,
what
yeah, yeah.
what
And
I'm up to.
yeah,
Yeah.
what comes to mind though is talking about emotions,
Yeah.
and people don't necessarily want to talk about their feelings. So, how do we develop? So it's like when we present to people, oh, emotional intelligence. How do we have them understand them and to support them in the what is? You know how people say, well, how do I do that? So you say like, get in touch with your emotions or understand how they impact your day to day. Is there a particular process for that?
Yeah, there's so many processes for that, and that's such a great question. And I think my first answer to that is always to come back into the moment and come back into the body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Slowing down is the first thing we can do in order to really make sense of what we're feeling. And I think, we talk a lot about like acknowledging the elephant in the room, right? Like, say we're in a meeting or we're in a group and we sort of feel or sense something and nobody's saying it. I think emotional self-awareness is really about acknowledging the elephant in the room within ourselves. It's really easy just to keep going and going and going and doing and performing and producing, right? And meanwhile, all of these feelings are trickling through us in the background. And so the first tool is really just to slow down, take a few deep breaths,
Mm-hmm.
and really tune in and see what arises. Um, which I think, it's interesting to see that emotional intelligence has gained kind of so much traction in the corporate sector and in the organizational sector. And I think there's a real reason for that. And that has a lot to do with the pace that people go at. And this idea we had for a long time that emotions don't exist in the workplace, that there's something that you leave in the door and then you come into work. And we all know that that is not true.
Right. I think I remember they used to say you take your emotions off with your pants, like right. Just take them off, right?
Just leave them right
Leave them
there.
to the side, right, and
Yeah,
don't
just
bring
go
them
in and
in.
perform. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting because I think about we talk about there's so many different emotions. We talk about anger, and there's a lot of like things around anger management, right? And different programs to support people in like dealing with their anger, right?
Yeah.
And then we look at that's not the only emotion though, right? that
It's not the only emotion. And what's interesting, and so really when we're talking about emotional intelligence, we're talking about these four quadrants. We're talking about emotional self-awareness. What do we understand about what we're feeling? Emotional self-management. What do we do with those feelings?
Mhm.
How do we sort of regulate our response internally?
Okay. Mhm.
Relationship awareness. How do we understand the emotions of others?
Mhm.
And then relationship management. What do we do with that information? How do we, with our understanding of how others are feeling and we're feeling, modulate our interactions? And I think anger is always an interesting one to me because I don't, for myself, I'll speak from personal experience. Anger is often a secondary emotion for me. Like when I'm feeling
Mhm.
a lot of rage,
Mhm.
and I'm like, I'm mad, I'm mad, I'm mad. If I really slow down and take the time, underneath that is usually a series of other emotions. Something like I'm sad, I'm
Mhm.
grieving, a whole other host of feelings
Mhm.
to be under the surface of rage for me. And I think that's true for a lot of people.
Mhm. And being able to break that down. And I like what you said in it's interesting in interacting with people, right? Because it's sort of we can't control what they do. We can only control how we respond to them. And I think it's really important if we can understand first our own emotions, and then we can start to look at others and how we respond to them through whatever their, whatever's going on with them.
Yeah.
So,
There's also, it's so interesting because there's a lot of studies that have been done too on something called emotional contagion, right? And what's found is that usually, so like in the case of an organization, the person with the most power in the room, usually the leader, their emotional state spreads like wildfire and impacts the emotional state of everyone around them. And so
Mm.
this is why emotional intelligence has been especially been more quickly to be adopted in terms of leadership development, because we
Okay. Mm-hmm.
leaders that can regulate their emotional state and like you, and also, you know, choose their perspective and what they're going to focus on and what they're going to sort of emanate to those around them, are more successful over the long term.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because something that came to mind when you're talking about being in an organization and leaders, you talk about the culture of the organization. I mean, a lot of things flash through my mind because I know that, as you
Mhm.
said, the leader is there, but there are some people who can come in and sabotage the whole thing. And understanding who really has the power, right? And who the people will really follow is a really important part of that whole culture thing, right?
Mhm.
And you know
Mhm.
how people have always said, it's hard to change a culture. Do you think that bringing in these type of like emotional intelligence, how do we kind of shift the culture? And is this one of the things that can support that shift in
Yeah.
culture?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's as hard to change culture. It's sometimes I think we confuse hard with something that takes discipline and time, right? So is it
Mm-hmm.
hard or does it just take time? I think like
Mm.
the culture, we tend not to like to do things that take time, right? We're like, oh, that's
Right.
hard.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there's so much that goes into cultural change and so much that goes into that example you just said, right? I mean, the question I ask is like, why? Why?
Right.
Why
Right.
is it that one person, you know, what does that one person need? What are the rules and norms for dealing with conflict in the team? How do we
Mm-hmm.
address those things? How does the culture
Mm-hmm.
say we can and should address those things?
Mm-hmm.
What are the values we have? Do we understand those? What do those look like in terms of behaviors? There's a lot of conversations that go into really understanding what this thing called culture is that we are feeling and sensing all of the time, everywhere, but especially in an organization.
Hmm. So yeah, like I hear you. There's so many different aspects, and I thought of a lot of different ones too. When new people come in, the old people don't want to change, so they hold on to the old, and there's all these different elements that go into um, being in organizations. And it just came to mind too. How happy are people really in that? Because now look
Mhm.
at the shift. They're running from the companies, right? I mean, to right, create their own thing to
Yeah.
do something different. So there's just this huge shift. And what I guess it's also, what are people willing to do now?
Yeah.
After these 2 years, what are they willing to put up with? Where, how do they see their lives? And so that's another whole shift.
Yeah, it's a huge shift. I know it's so right on. I was thinking about this before coming on the show tonight and thinking about, you know, knowing that there's that you and like what you're offering here to your listeners is a focus on spirituality and thinking about like the spiritual crisis that I think we find ourselves in now that is showing up in workforce trends like the great resignation, with people leaving en masse, or quiet quitting, right, which is kind of just another term for employee disengagement, with people
Mhm.
saying, no, I'm actually not going to show up and work 50 hours a week anymore. I'm actually
Yeah.
just gonna do the bare minimum that it takes to get my job done. And when I look at those trends on the rise in the context of the pandemic, in the context of, you know, in America, our reckoning, the beginning of our great reckoning with systemic injustice, and all of the things, all of the violence that has occurred over the past 2 years, all the things that we've been grappling with, I do think most human beings, whether they're conscious of it or not, are in a time of existential crisis, right? Of being like, the world feels really unsure.
Yeah.
What do I actually want? What actually matters to me at the deepest level? If I were to die tomorrow, what would I have wanted to have done? Who would I wanted to have kept company with? Um,
Mhm. Deep question.
those are big questions. Yeah, those are big questions.
And
Yeah.
that's where people are. you know. And aside from what I think about though is how do we decrease the panic? When I think about spiritual practices, how
Mm.
do we get them to a level where you can even embrace a spiritual practice, right? And you know,
Mhm.
I say you come from the other end. Well, take the spiritual practice to bring you to a new space. And I was on a show about mental health.
Mm.
And one of the things she said to me, well, Reverend G, if I can't pay my rent and I can't have any food and I have all these things, how am I going to even think about it? You know, and that's a real question.
That
When we
is a real
start
question.
to look at, you know, we want to support people. We'll say, oh, shift and, you know, do these things. But there's a mental health crisis and there's a real crisis with people not getting their basic needs, right?
Mm. Yeah.
And struggling with it, you know, and being so when I look at it, I always try to think, how do we support that? And that's where I think maybe spiritual practices come into play.
Yeah.
And um I
Yeah.
always go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say it raises a question for me of what do we mean when we say spiritual practice? Because I think like
Hmm.
I think you're right on, right? It's and this is I'm thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a framework
Hmm.
that I reference all the time just because it's I find it to be so valuable, right? Which is like if our
Exactly.
basic needs for food, shelter, water, life, right,
Right.
aren't met, then at the top of the hierarchy is self-actualization. How are we going to be able to focus on that if our basic needs aren't met,
Enough.
right?
Right.
And I think that's really real. And I think sometimes we conflate spiritual practice with like, oh, if I'm going to have spiritual practice, I need to put up an altar and like sit down at that altar for 2 hours a day and like
Right.
reach some
Hmm.
sort of like transcendental state that like is
Right.
is
Exactly.
not realistic for our
Yeah.
everyday lives and is like
Yeah.
not something that, that's kind of the work of a lot of advanced quote
Right.
unquote spiritual
And
practitioners.
that's why I say we want to talk about it from a practical point of view,
Yeah.
right? I'm just a simple, when you came on, you just took a deep breath. That's a practice that in the moment when you are just like, I don't know what to do, just stop, get in touch with your breath, right?
Yeah.
That's some way to bring you back, right? Because you also mentioned about present moment and being in the present. I always say, in this moment, all is well. And
Yeah.
when we can bring ourselves to the
Mm.
present moment, there's some peace there, right? Because it's like,
There
what's
is
happening?
there is some peace there and so it takes so much noticing. I mean, it's really constant. Thinking about this today because I was thinking about just for myself, like all the ways I slip out of presence. And especially there's so many distractions available to all of us, right? It's really easy just to like really quick get onto these little phones we have that just like suck all of our
Oh
attention.
my God, yes.
And like when you look at the emotions, for example, someone scrolling social media, when you look at the emotions that are running through that person as they're doing that, I mean, they are feeling sadness, they're feeling shame, they're feeling excitement, they're feeling
Yeah.
regret. I mean, it's like
Hmm.
it's a lot for the system to take and it's happening unconsciously. It's like we're not even totally aware, right? And then we're like, whew, why do I feel so
Right, right,
bad? And so, when I think about a spiritual practice and like a spiritual practice, and this is me talking to myself right now because I have to
right,
do my own
right.
medicine on this. A spiritual practice is shutting off all your devices after 8 o'clock at night, right?
Yeah, yeah,
That can be a spiritual
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. And as I've done this show, I've just learned so many different spiritual practices. It's not about, because everybody's like, oh, meditation, but that's not the only, right? It's one that over time, if you practice, then you will find a way to meditate. But it's everybody has their own. I say your spiritual toolkit is very personal
yeah.
because it's the things that work for you,
Mhm.
right? Whatever works for you is what works for you, but there are so many ways. I mean, through music, through art, through nature, through every aspect you can
Mm,
create.
mhm,
I say a spiritual practice. You know, it's interesting because you said, well, what do we consider a spiritual practice? And a lot of times, you know, when you put the word spirituality in or spiritual, people already have some notion about what that is, right? And so I want to use the word so that people are open to what a spiritual practice means. And
mm,
it's just feeding your spirit. What is going to support your inner God's, your
mm.
soul.
Yeah, the word soul, I think, is the word that sticks the most with me, right? This thing that, like, and this is where our belief systems come into play, right? So when I think of soul, I think like, what is that essence? I have a soul, you have a soul. I think
Mhm,
organizations have a soul, right? It's like, what
mhm,
is that essence or that energy
mhm,
that exists no matter what? It's almost
mhm,
like you can feel into that independent of how it manifests in the
mhm,
material world. Um, and when I think about the soul, like that is a spiritual practice for me to sit down and say, okay, I'm going to connect with my soul right now. The part of me that has lived and experienced more than like my mind could ever fathom, but
mhm,
the part of
mhm,
me that I can feel deep within me. And even just asking, I think this is the part where language becomes so important for me in my own practice too, of just like calling in and forth that higher soul,
mhm,
asking that my body, mind, will, emotions be connected to that soul. And immediately when I do that, again, like it takes 2 seconds and I can just feel a little bit more expanded, right? And I think, yeah, I think a lot about time, and this thing we're in around time, where we're like
mhm,
running out of time. I have no time. Like time is now. It's only
mhm.
now.
It's a lot.
Yeah,
I
right.
have this phrase I always use is everything is in perfect divine order.
Mm,
So whatever time it is the perfect right time,
mm,
right? And so I do use a lot of affirmations that's really support me. One of my practices is I can
mhm,
get some affirmations and I can write some great ones, right? And I
mm,
can make myself feel so good, right?
mm, mm.
Using affirmations, but that's a practice that works for me.
Yeah.
And we talk about that. When I met you through ELP, right?
Mhm,
And
mhm.
and it's an interesting group for me because I feel like, wow, so like for me sometimes, right? And
You
I
so
just
what is tell me more, like, so, like,
yeah, it's like I have to get into my head like more, right? Because when I'm thinking about something you just said, when you were talking about like systems, you know how you guys talk about changing
yeah,
systems everywhere, right? And it's a lot to think about. Right? That's what I mean by it's like, whoa, right? It's just
yeah,
sometimes it's so much, right, to think
yeah.
about. So I'll read everything and I'll be like, oh, it's just too much to think about, right?
Granetta, I appreciate you so much. I appreciate that you named that, right? Because you're not alone in that. You think about all this language around systems change, and you think about how many people out there are like, that is just too overwhelming to think of.
Yeah,
How do we change an entire system?
exactly.
And I want to just offer something to you and to our listeners, and again
Mhm,
to myself, because these are all things I'm reminding myself.
mhm,
If we think about a system as a variety of like interconnected parts, right? So, like a family is a system. Every member of the family is connected through DNA, through different positions in the family, right? And I always see a system as a bunch of little dots, almost connected by pieces, infinite pieces of string.
mhm,
One little move, one rotation, one change in perspective from one part of the system impacts the rest of the system just due to the interconnectivity.
mhm,
And I say that not only because I've seen that to be true,
Mhm.
but because I think it can feel so overwhelming to think, how do I work with all these parts at once?
Mhm.
And really what it is to change a system is a series of small movements in different parts of the system, right? Like one thing has to change, and then you have to
Exactly.
step back and say, how did that land? How did that go? Another thing shifts.
Mhm.
Um, so I hope that's helpful to anyone out there who's feeling overwhelmed by
Right.
thinking, about
And
systems.
and it is helpful. And what I could say too is taking it in small bites, right? And then being able to work with that. But as you said, with so much information coming in, how much time are we generally going to stay in a particular subject? Unless
Mm,
it just
mm,
like grabs you. And just because I'm a part of the group, and I think everything that you guys are talking about and working on is so important that I can pick up, and say, okay, well, that's interesting. I learn a lot, and I go in the back and I
mhm.
read about it, right? And
Oh,
then say, okay, that's really good, right? And
mm,
you had mentioned the family. Um,
mm.
let's talk about, you said, you want to talk about the family and ancestry. What would you like to share about that?
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about like what's again in preparation for my conversation with you tonight, thinking about just the spiritual practices that have most supported me and
Mhm,
most inform my work. And
mhm.
family constellations work
Okay.
has been a huge area of study and practice for me, and that looks a lot at ancestors, ancestral patterns, right? It looks a lot at what are causes or reasons for us feeling or behaving in certain ways that don't just always exist in the here and now of our lives, right? It kind of
Mhm, mhm,
perspective to say, how do these things live in the family system? What is the subconscious of the system that I come from? How does the family relate and connect? How have things that have happened in other generations been passed down to me in this generation? And without even talking about family constellations, I think one of the most profound spiritual practices for me has been to like actively connect with my own ancestry, um, and to connect with my lineage and to do the research of where do I come from, who are the people that I come from, and then
mhm,
in my own meditation practice to connect with those ancestors as well. And that
mhm,
for me has felt both like a huge form of support personally.
mhm.
And it also helps me understand that, like, we here on Earth are part of a much longer timeline that we can't even begin to, like, understand,
Mhm, mhm, mhm,
you know?
mhm,
And it helps me widen my understanding of time, in a way that allows me to feel some peace, actually.
mhm, mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that is interesting. And it's interesting when you talk about family, the ancestry, because a lot lately you've been hearing a lot about people, tracing back and finding out who their ancestors are. And as you talk about it from the perspective of not just knowing, but understanding the impact that it's still having on
Yeah.
your life now, and approaching it from that perspective, what things are still being carried on from
Yeah.
then to now is another whole way of dealing with this whole ancestry family dynamics.
Yeah, I do think it's really interesting, when I look at like what are the trends happening out in the world right now. I think this obsession with ancestry.com or 23andMe or is one of the trends that I see of people getting really curious of like who are the people that I come from. And
Mhm,
I acknowledge too that like I've met a lot of people who have a lot of fear around looking at the people that they come from because we all have violence in our ancestry,
mhm,
some of us more than others have like long histories of perpetration. Um,
Mhm.
but we also have a lot of gifts in our ancestry.
Mhm.
I think in order to feel those gifts, we have to be able to turn and really look.
Mhm. And really look, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's what you were saying. Like the trends is interesting. I like the deeper meaning of going forward with it and looking at it from that perspective.
Mhm.
Um, let's shift and talk about your storytelling, right?
Mhm.
um, when did you start young telling stories, or how did you get into?
Yeah,
And how has it shifted over time, and what
yeah,
impact you find now?
yeah. I've always been a writer, so that's the way I've told stories. Some people are really good oral storytellers. I've always been a writer. And storytelling has been another tool for me over the years of really helping me make sense of my experience, really helping me get beneath those layers of emotion, right? So I can come in being like, I'm feeling this. And then
Mhm.
through the act of telling the story, or I'm like, oh, I'm actually feeling all these other things that they weren't the
Mm,
first
mm,
emotions to show up, but they're underneath there. And it also helps me, like you said, feel really connected to life. In the writing, in the storytelling,
mhm,
I get to relive what are the senses, what are the colors, what are the
mhm,
textures of things,
mhm,
and those memories create a really rich internal world for me. So yeah,
mhm,
storytelling has long been a tool, and then I did a lot of work with the Great Place to Work Institute, which is a consultancy in San Francisco. They evaluate organizations for Fortune magazine's 100 best place to work list, this list that comes out every year and says, who's the
mhm,
top of the top in corporate culture, where employees most happy. And what I noticed of years of looking at companies on that list is the role of storytelling in organizations.
mhm,
I think a lot of organizations that are considered great places to work are both
mhm.
telling strong stories internally, stories that are shaping the culture, and they're telling a strong story externally, right? Which we might call like their brand or their brand story. And there's
Mhm,
a lot of
mhm,
cohesion between those stories. And so my storytelling work has morphed to really helping entrepreneurs and organizations figure out like what's the story of your business? What's the story?
mm,
Why does this story matter to your employees? Why does it matter to your audience? Who are you trying to reach? What are the narratives that like are shared between you and the people that you're trying to reach? Um,
mhm,
and so again, it's been both a personal practice for me and something that I use a lot in my professional life.
mhm. Being able to, yeah, it's the writing, right? And being able to tell the story through writing. It's
Mhm.
very, I think that I do journaling. I've done
Mm.
that. And I've started to work on really trying to write a book, right? Or well, not trying.
Yeah.
I am,
You
right?
are
But
writing a book, yeah.
I am. That's what I'm saying. I'm not trying. I'm doing it, right?
You are.
If I would just do it more, right?
Yes, I know
But
the discipline. It's always the discipline. Yeah,
it's
yeah.
always the discipline, because I can remember when at a time we was like, okay, so every morning for 15 minutes, just write, and then if you do it, you'll see. Because I
Yeah.
have from doing that consistently, but then you stop, right? And then it's like, okay, get back, to the consistency. And I think that even when I talk about spiritual practices, also, it's the consistency
Yeah.
in doing something that can support you, and that's with anything. If you want to learn anything, you have to consistently practice until you get it. And even once you get there, if you want to get better, you still practicing,
Yeah.
right?
It is
Practice.
it is the consistency, and we need each other. I mean, I know we love to
Mhm.
think in this I know we love to think in American culture that we can go it alone. I am the queen of thinking,
Mhm.
"I got this. I'll do it on
Mhm.
my own time. I don't need
Right.
anyone to support me through this." But
We do.
really helpful. I find that when I'm writing most and when I'm writing my best or storytelling my best is when I'm part of a writer's group or I'm like committed every week and held
Right.
accountable.
Right. That does give you that consistency, right? And when you said like we really need each other, it made me think about how we were so isolated before. Like, excuse me, we had all of our great communities, then we had none.
Yeah.
And then here we are now, where a lot of people are still in breakdown. You studied psychology, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, can you talk about like some of the changes you've seen since COVID and now, and um, any suggestions for how we can kind of tackle some of these? So one thing I want to say first, so many people that I did not realize were depressed. It's like everybody's coming
Yeah.
out like I'm depressed. I've been depressed, right? And it seems overwhelming to me sometimes to think that so many people feel so disconnected, I guess is a word that I might use.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that, yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead. Mm.
No, you go ahead. It was like I think I just went on.
Um, yeah, I mean, that disconnection is so layered, right? And again, I think if we're looking out at what's happening in the world right now, if we're looking at climate change, if we're looking at the mass amounts of violence, I mean, one of the things that was happening before COVID, right, is we have access. Never before in history have we had access to so much information. So it used to be that we would live in our small
Wow.
communities and we would know what was happening in the community.
Mhm.
And, we could adjust, we could show up. There was ways that we could even figure out how to plug in and be a part of a solution. Now we have access to things that are happening in every corner of the world. And I do think it's quite honestly like too
Right.
much at this point for our nervous systems to handle, right? So
Right.
the sense of hopelessness,
Mm.
the sense of despair is so readily available for all of us to experience. And I think if we are not resourcing ourselves with some of the things that we talked about, like time in the natural world, a lot of us haven't been able to resource ourselves with time with community. If we don't feel connected to something like that's a little bit larger and more expanded, like our soul or the blessings of our ancestors or whatever that is, um, it's really easy to be in a state of overwhelm. I also will
Mhm.
say that I had COVID in early September, so about a month ago.
Mhm.
And aside from the physical, the, the stuffed up head and being exhausted and being in bed, I noticed a lot of depression. And I was reading that 1 in 3 people who experience COVID experience depression during and for 1 to 6 months after. And so I name that because I think that's also
Okay.
of the mental health crisis that we're in. That's not, people think of COVID as being purely a physical thing, but I think it certainly has a mental and emotional impact on us. Um, and then we have our
Mhm.
workplaces, right? And a lot of people are doing remote work. And part of remote work is
And
that,
they don't want to go back.
and it's, I don't blame people, right? It's like if you are, especially, if you have a family, if you have a community that you like to spend time with and you are commuting an hour to work and an hour from, I mean, all of a sudden people got back portions of their day that they don't want to let go of. That makes,
Mhm.
being able to be with your pet in the middle of the day, whatever that is, that makes so much sense. And
Mhm.
we need to feel connected to our coworkers, to our collaborators in some way that goes beyond the goals and the to-do list, right? And companies, I
Mhm.
think, are really trying to figure this out right now. There are studies that show that people who feel really connected to at least one person at work, like have like a best work friend, do better in the workplace. They have better well-being. They're more engaged. It's like we are human. We are human beings.
Right.
We're
Right.
beings. We are not human doings, and so
That's what we say, right? Yeah.
and we need to find way. Like companies need to find ways, albeit virtually, to help employees connect. And I think storytelling is a great way to do that. So like getting employees together and asking them to share. I mean, one great prompt, and this comes from some friends of mine, Adam Rosendahl, who runs a company called Late Night Art that I do some facilitation for. He goes into organizations and facilitates cultural change and team building through the arts and storytelling. One of the great activities that he leads, two people sit across from each other and they each share with each other a little window into their childhood, into a moment of joy from their childhood. So, for me, the first one I ever shared was we used to go play hide and go seek in the cornfields at the end of my road. And I'm noticing as I'm telling this story, not only am I so lit up because I'm like, wow, I haven't thought about that in so long. And it was so magical. And the corn stalks were so high and just seeing the open sky above. So not only is it putting me into a good emotional state, but whoever's on the receiving end of that all of a sudden gets to know a little bit about me, right? And it's not a big moment of vulnerability. It's not like a big share. It's not a big catharsis. It's like something even these small storytelling moments help people feel more connected, right? And then the other person can say, you can look at this activity goes, you share your story, and then the other person shares 3 things that they can tell about who you are as a person or have learned about you through that little tiny vignette of a story. And it's amazing what people share. It's amazing. And it's amazing how connected people feel all of a sudden. Again, these are small, like little small things that have a big impact.
Impact, right. Yeah, at this point, we need something at my company, right? At this point, we really do, because we are just now going back, like full time almost, like 4 days, 3 days. So that's pretty, to me, I'm back at work every day. If I have to go in 4 days, 1 week, and 3, I'm back at work pretty much, you know?
Yeah.
And yeah, the impact of that, because we have to see, as you said, companies have to do something to support this new movement and to support people coming back into the workplace. And that's where we'll have to see. But I like that idea you had, that you just gave, right? It's interesting because people want to know other people. And the other thing you said too that was really cool was people that have one work buddy seem to do better at work. It's really interesting. Yeah. That's thinking about that.
I mean, I tend to, I mean, like I'm sure you and many listeners can resonate. This whole thing of like going back to normal, quote unquote normal. It's like, there's no going back to, there's no, what's normal at this point in time.
There's no what's normal, right? I lock my door now and you have to knock. It's not wide open. Before, my office door was open. Now it's not open, right? And that's really huge that people are keeping their doors closed.
Well, it's a huge adjustment for the nervous system too, you know? Sorry, we have a little bit of a lag until we're talking over each other.
Okay. So let's shift a bit. I ask all my guests to take us through your spiritual journey. You grew up in the church or as a thing, and then where are you today? Tell us a little story.
I did not grow up with any religion or religious practice. My father's side is Jewish. My great-grandfather was a rabbi, but by the time it got to my dad, there was just a real void of Judaic practice or Judaic history or lessons within the family. My mom was pretty spiritual. Like, I remember there being tarot cards around. I remember being really interested in those when I was a kid. I remember her meditating for periods of time. I remember her singing a lot, being really into music and spending some Saturdays just singing, and a lot of reading and writing. My mother's also a writer. So I think creativity was part of the spirituality I grew up around, or spiritual practice. I've always been really into tarot cards and symbols and imagery and archetypes and the many ways that we can give and find meaning in things. And man, my spiritual journey, I think about this a lot because I try and think, like, what was it when I was a kid? I think in general, I was always asking big questions, like, what are we doing here? Like, that was always a question for me. Who am I? Who am I really? What is this, a dream? Is life just a dream that I'm walking through? What's the meaning? What's the purpose? And then, through my teens and my 20s, just starting to notice a lot of ways that energy shifted in different environments, noticing a lot of like synchronicities, noticing having a really active internal world. I was an only child, so I had a lot of imaginary friends.
Yeah.
I would spend time cutting out pictures and magazines of places I wanted to go that I later went to. So I think I was doing a lot of manifestation work without really knowing.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Manifestation work. But yeah, my spiritual practice has taken a lot of different forms. I traveled a lot from when I was 18 to my mid 20s. I traveled all over the world, lived all over the world, and I just had some pretty wild things happen that convinced me that there was some other kind of higher order at play. Yeah. And then really in the past 3 or 4 years, really turning to really using my time in meditation to both like connect with myself and my higher self and my soul, but also with my ancestors, to be really open to whatever images or words want to come. And I feel like there's a conversation that I'm having with spirit, with the universe, with my soul, that as I've aged and gotten older has just gotten richer and deeper, and more alive in some way.
I know you have a daughter, right? As a mom, right?
Yeah.
What, I always ask parents this in terms of spirituality and church and all that. How are you teaching her? Because I grew up in the church and we were just forced to do that, right? So it was that how it was, right? How do you think you will expose your daughter to like religion or spirituality?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I mean, I think that so I have a daughter, my partner has 3 kids, so we have 4 between the 2 of us. So we have a very active household. And though we don't go to church and aren't part of any religion necessarily, I do think that some of the same things that happen in the church or happen in a religious context happen in our household. So like understanding just like the value of ritual, right? The value of coming together, understanding the value of being in community, understanding the value of like using our words and our emotional awareness. I think we teach our kids a lot of emotional intelligence skills, right? So I feel like part of the ways that I'm helping my daughter come in touch with her soul is to really just sit and be like, how are you feeling? How and she always has, you know, she's 9. She doesn't have the most complex vocabulary for things.
Mhm.
And also teaching them how to relate to one another. You know, when there's conflicts in our house, my partner's really good at this. We don't
Mhm.
intervene. We're like, you guys have the skills to work it out. Go talk to each other. Ask them how they were feeling. Tell them how you were trying to
Mhm.
understand where one another is coming from. So yeah, I don't know if that's a straightforward answer to the question, but I also
No,
really,
I get it.
yeah,
Um it was an interesting question, and what I get is that, just teaching them how to live in their lives, how to communicate, how to be kind, how to be good people, and all of that is a very great foundation for whatever else they um get later, because 10% of what I was told 10% of what we give them is what they get, and there's 90% of stuff out there, right?
yeah, yeah,
that
yeah,
that is
yeah.
going to impact them,
Totally,
right?
totally.
And at a certain point, based on all that 90%, they'll decide, oh my, I want to go to church with Susie, right? Or you know what I'm saying? Something will come up where
Yeah,
they're like, or let's practice these Jewish practices or these rituals, So at some point, as the curiosity kick in, or as they hear others, then they'll come, and then you'll be able to support them in that.
yeah.
And the other thing, what would you this would be interesting for you. I want to hear your 3 top spiritual practices for you, and
Mm,
how do they support you?
my 3 top spiritual practices. Honestly, the first is just sitting and focusing on the breath. I mean, that is like,
That is like,
it's and it sounds so, I think, unromantic. It's so unromantic and unsexy. You know what I mean? I wish I could like tell you
yeah,
something, but it's so, so powerful.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Um, so I'll just say like my morning practice, which I, am sometimes more consistent with than other times, is
Mhm,
sitting, focusing on my breath, calling in and forth my higher self. And I can
mhm,
already feel like usually my attention goes sort of up, like almost into my pineal gland, like in the center of my head. I can feel that connection to my higher self because my body starts to relax
mhm,
and there's just a sense of peace that comes
mhm,
over me. Yeah, and then I'll just do a scan of my body, like how does my energy field feel? What's lingering
mhm,
beneath the surface? And then I tend to call forth my ancestors, my guides, my spiritual protectors, and bring through any communication that wants to happen there. And then I do still really love tarot cards and oracle decks. I think it's really powerful to just pull a card
mhm,
and feel whatever message comes through and to just sit with that wisdom for like 5 minutes every morning.
mhm,
That's kind of my contemplative practice. So
mhm. Yeah, and that's really interesting, because what's different, and I don't think we've talked about on the show, is the pulling of the cards and the tarot cards and the
mm,
oracle cards, and how you can use those as a practice to support you. So I like when I get new things for the spiritual toolkit, right? To support people, and just the idea is there's so many options,
so many
you
options.
know so many. So just being even willing to explore and know about the different options, and say,
Mhm.
oh, like today, as you talk about the breath, is that simple? If somebody heard that and said, "Oh, is it that simple?"
Mm.
And then just be able to do a simple process of just getting in touch with their breath and breathing. And as you said, it's really powerful when you can just be in touch with the breath. It relaxes you. I find a sense of peace. I exactly know exactly what you're talking about. And I do meditation and I can just drop right into this place where it just feels great, right?
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and but practice over time, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah.
The discipline part is really the discipline part is huge, and I think, the practice doesn't need to be long, but it's just about the consistency. It's just about,
Exactly.
and it's the same thing with emotional intelligence, right? It's just about the consistency of, like, pausing, naming your emotions, understanding your triggers, understanding your response, and every time showing up and saying, "Okay, can I respond in a different way this time? Can I slow it down enough so I can respond in a different way this time?"
Mhm. Mhm. I
And
like that. Just the pause, right?
just the pause,
Yeah.
slow it down, and just carving new neural pathways, right? Like, okay, if I know I feel
Mhm.
this and then I respond this way, can I slow
Mhm.
that down so when I feel that I respond a new way? And discipline, I do that enough times,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
oh, I'm not responding to that thing in the same way that I once was. So,
Mhm.
yeah, practice, practice,
Yeah.
practice.
Practice. Yeah, that's why I say practice, 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 and consistency, right?
Mm.
Is just the key. And let's see, what else did I have that I want to touch? Anything else you want to share with us?
Mm.
Mm. So,
Mm.
oh, I know. Let's just, because this has been a wonderful conversation, talk about new realm coaching
Yeah.
and how you got started with that and how people can find you and what you're doing within this coaching practice.
Yeah. So my business is New Realm Coaching and Consulting, and you can find me on the internet, the place where all businesses exist. Um, and I offer one-on-one coaching. So I coach leaders in developing self-awareness and some of the skills we're talking about today, including like honing in on their intuition and understanding the difference between what is their intuition and what is their mind, just sort of rampantly driving the show. I also work with entrepreneurs, doing some coaching with them to help them figure out what is the story that they're telling, what is their purpose, what is their mission, what is their values in the world, and how is that expressed through their businesses and their creative projects. And I also work with organizations doing work in organizational culture. So, again, having conversations around what are the values, what are the behaviors, what does that look like across the organization? How do we have healthy, thriving teams where people can navigate conflict and are taking that time to connect and relate? And I also co-host a podcast, First Person Plural, Emotional Intelligence and Beyond. So you can tune in to me there. I co-host that with Daniel Goleman, who many know as one of the great thought leaders in the realm of emotional intelligence. And yeah, I think that's yeah. I do a
Yeah,
lot.
that's
I do
great
a
for
lot. I do a
context.
lot.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Um, and that's exciting to know that you have a podcast that people can tune in because I think getting in touch with our emotions is really important and it's really going to support us in living our best lives,
Yeah.
in being our best self, finding our purpose, right? And I like what you said is like changing those emotions. Oh, I usually react like this, but becoming aware, then I can shift and say, oh, I'll react differently. And then in practice, I automatically become different
Yeah.
as I become aware of that trigger or that response. So
Mhm.
I'm loving the whole idea around emotional intelligence, right? And there's work that all of us can do around just getting in touch with our emotions and how we're responding
Mhm.
and So thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you. Is there anything else you want to share before we wrap it up?
No, I think that's it for tonight. I mean, there's so many other
Yeah.
pathways we could go down, but we would be here for another 3 hours.
Yeah. Right. It's
Yeah.
been really, really, really great having you, and it's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend G. Mm.
All right. I'll be in touch. Thank you for joining me tonight on Conversations with Reverend G. I'm here every Monday night live from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. on WEMS Radio. We're on Facebook, we're on YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter. So join me again next week right here at 8 p.m. Conversations with Reverend G. I'm here to support you in living your best life with joy, with grace and ease. And check me out every day on Facebook as Reverend Grenetta Mason and on Instagram as Rev Grenetta. So until next week, check out your emotions. How intelligent are you about your emotions? Do you even recognize them? Do you work with them? So I think it's really interesting for us to start looking at our emotions and seeing how we can shift, change, and have them support us in being our best self. I'll see you next week.